Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the LCLC podcast. The first season of this podcast is devoted to compiling an oral history of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, or the LCLC, a conference that began back in 1972 here at the University of Louisville and continued without interruption for 48 years until the cancellation of the 2021 conference due to the COVID pandemic. I'm your host, Matthew Biberman, and I decided to start this podcast after I was tapped to be the conference's new director in the summer of 2021. This podcast exists as my way both to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the LCLC, an event that will happen with our 2023 conference, while also learning what I need to know to ensure that the conference has continued success into the future. In this episode, the first of a two-part interview, I talk with Stanley Fish, who delivered the critical keynote at the LCLC's 2006 conference. Currently the Florsheimmer Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at the Cardozo Law School at Yeshiva University, Stanley Fish began his academic career in the English department at the University of California, Berkeley. Fish then became the Keenan Professor of English and Humanities at Johns Hopkins, where he taught from 1974 to 1985, before becoming Arts and Sciences Professor of English and Professor of Law at Duke University. He was then Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois from 1999 to 2004. Professor Fish is a prolific author, having written over 200 scholarly articles and books. Fish is that rare intellectual whose voice extends beyond the academy, and his commentary often appears in public forums the world over, though perhaps most frequently in the New York Times, where his opinionator blogs excite intense debate. My own association with Professor Fish dates back to my graduate school days, where I was fortunate enough to have him as the director of my doctoral dissertation, a project I completed in 1998 before then revising into my first scholarly monograph, Masculinity, Anti-Semitism, and Early Modern English Literature. I began our discussion with the question I'd like to ask all my guests here on the LCLC podcast. What do you remember about your visit to Louisville?
Well, I remember it very fondly, but I don't remember the content of my talk. You can perhaps refresh my memory.
Well, I too remember it very fondly. I remember getting you at the airport, and at that time I had my father was living with me, and I had his Grand Marquis, and I picked you up in the Grand Marquis, and that seemed to suit you. I remember you were able to cross your legs in the
Right.
front seat, and we drove around. I gave you a little tour of the city, and two other students of yours, Ben Saunders and Graham Hamill, came in, and we gave a panel together in your honor.
Oh, right. Very nice.
You shared the podium with Kerry Wolf, and his talk focused on animal rights, something that he's very well known for writing on, and how questions of belief and interpretation, that is, what constitutes an animal versus what constitutes a human, and then something that the two of you kind of come together on, which is legal issues, that the legal issues that follow from that distinction sets up issues such as extinction for animals. And he proceeded to give a talk in that direction, and then you gave a talk about Credo. The title of the talk was Credo, and you were in a jag at that point of talking about Credo as a sense of that when you boil down arguments and you go down the anti-foundational road, you end up at a first principle that is belief itself.
Oh, yes. Now I recall. Yeah.
So did I do an adequate job there of summarizing your
you
talk?
did. Thank you.
Okay. So what else do you remember about your visit to Louisville?
Now, those are the main things. I do remember liking the town. And if I'm correct, a friend of mine happened to be in town that I was able to see him, and that was nice.
I do remember a couple of other things that happened on that visit that stand out in my memory. One was that this was February 2006, so we weren't too far into George W. Bush's second term, and we were having dinner. Graham Hamill, Ben Saunders, myself, and you. And I asked you for your read on contemporary American politics, that as a then relatively young man, it seemed to me that the American experiment in democracy, particularly in the still relatively new post 9/11 surveillance phase, it seemed to me that the wheels were coming off of democracy. And your feeling at the time was that this was pretty normal for you. And I wonder if you would update us as to what you think of the state of American democracy as you and I are talking now in 2021.
Yeah, I'm sure what I said to you back in 2006 was, as you indicated, that these fears reoccur in American history at various points during, the ascendancy of the Know Nothing Party in the 19th century, or the frenzy about Bolsheviks and communists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The sense that the Supreme Court was not advancing the causes of justice and freedom as one would hope they would do. But that, I said then, I'm sure, nevertheless, the Republic seems to persist, largely because the basic institutions that carry us, that the vehicle of our aspirations, even when they seem to be bumbling along and barely proceeding, those institutions are still strongly in place. And I can see reasons why someone today might think that view has been challenged by recent events, and that, for example, distrust of the press has never been as venomous as it is now. The general unwillingness to accept expert opinion in almost any area, and a turn to what we might call epistemological populism, which is a movement that gives nationwide force to the old, and I think horrible statement, "My opinion is as good as yours." So it seems to me that there's an argument to be made that we now live in a "my opinion is as good as yours" world, where a kind of debased libertarianism held out by people who have never read John Stuart Mill argues that there should be no constraints on our behavior whatsoever, and there should be no attempt by government or by professional experts to tell us the truth about any matter. We should be able to decide for ourselves. I think that spirit is more vigorously alive today than it has been before. And one also points to the effects of the Trump presidency and the apparent secession of the Republican Party from politics as we know it. And instead, the Republican Party now practices something else. It would be hard to give it a name, but it isn't standard politics. So that one could feel that, as you put it, the wheels are falling off. I have friends, many, who believe exactly that. There are people in the New York Times like Ezra Klein or other commentators who are sounding that alarm, but I still can't quite make myself feel that pessimistic.
You still can't make yourself feel that pessimistic. Are you an optimist by nature?
I guess I am an optimist by nature. I do think that things will work out. Of course, things don't always work out on every level. One is often disappointed in life in ways that cannot be recovered. But I think for me in general, things work out. But one must remember that back in the late 20s and early 30s, there were assimilated Jews in Germany who probably felt the same way, who indeed I know from reading documents and reports felt the same way. That they felt that their place in the culture of Germany was secure, and that this particular political regime would pass into history, and things would return to something approaching the condition they knew. That didn't happen, as we, of course, know. But I know that there are parallels to be drawn, but I can't quite today yet draw those parallels to the conclusion that the wheels are coming off the democracy. As a registered Democrat, more or less, shall I say, slightly left of center, not much left of center, I find myself, as usual, being disappointed in the inability of the Democratic Party to practice the art of politics in a way that secures them victories. But perhaps they'll learn.
While driving into the interview, I was thinking again about how much I enjoyed How to Write a Sentence, and it occurred to me that a book along the lines that you're suggesting now might be a good Stanley Fish book. That is, How to Practice Power Politics from the Left Side and Win. Has anybody ever approached you, given your track record here, to write such a kind of crossover populist book?
And no one has, and I'm not sure that I would be qualified to do so. There are, of course, people like James Carville, who is, at least as far as I know, not an author, although he may have written something that I haven't read, and others who are offering recommendations and analyses, but to the political left at this moment. But as you know, Matthew, I tend to stick to matters that I really believe I'm reasonably knowledgeable about. And though I think as an observer of the political scene, I'm relatively well informed. I'm probably not well informed enough to write that kind of book.
What about a book that drew off of your experience as not just a successful academic in terms of scholarship, but as you moved into administrative positions? I often think back to the class that I took with you on First Amendment law at the Duke. It was in the Duke University Law School. And you, at that time, liked to take issue with Amy Gutman.
Yes.
And her vision of the world that you felt wanted to transform the world into a dinner party at Princeton.
Exactly.
And then you would often point out that as a long resident of academia, that the superficial pleasantries of our shared profession often fall away. And then you would turn very Miltonic in your language and say, have they walked the halls with these with these colleagues that can often turn into a den of vipers? And yet you figured out how to manage them and create, in the case of Duke's English department, perhaps the most powerful English department at the time in America. You have those skills. If I was an acquiring editor, I would seek you out to write a book about how to succeed in management and administration.
Well, that is a possibility, and the lessons that would be delivered could be delivered fairly succinctly. An administrator is someone who is in charge of an operation that has a product and a goal, although in the academic context, the product is the advancement of knowledge and the goal is further progress along the road of that advancement. So it's not like the usual product. But nevertheless, I think the principle that I would enunciate is the same across all administrative realms, which is to recognize the energies and talents of those under your administration and institute conditions that release those energies and talents rather than block them. Now, that's a very general statement, and it would have to be fleshed out with any number of examples. But if you go into administration with that idea, these people, instructors, staff members, students, are very talented people. They're unusually so, or else they would not have made it into this particular position. Let's find ways to make their talent available both to them and therefore to us. Now, I'll give you a concrete example going back to the Duke English Department. When I became chairman of the Duke English Department, and I'm not going to name names here, I discovered that there was a group of what we might call lifetime associate professors. You probably remember at least a few of them. And what I discovered, in part by talking to them, in part by just looking at the records, is that each of them had stalled at a certain point because a project, a significant project, had either been abandoned or had been in process so long that one felt confident that it would never be complete. I met with each of these and I proposed the following bargain. If you will finish that project, book, edition, whatever it might be, that you have either put on the shelf or work at only occasionally, if you will finish that, I will get you promoted. And I felt that I could make that promise because I would be able to argue persuasively in whatever higher administration context was necessary for these people. And several of them did take advantage of this offer. And one of them who didn't, I'll never forget this, said to me, "I wish you had come here earlier." Mm-hmm. He didn't feel that at this stage in his life, he was able to accept the bargain and do his part. That's just a small example. Mm-hmm. When I got to the University of Illinois at Chicago as a dean, one of the things I noticed is that there was no faculty dining room. Again, that doesn't seem to be at the heart of the academic enterprise, but in some ways it is, because it provides a place for conversation, for fellowship, for mutual recognition of a group identity. So I worked out a way to have a faculty a dining room built, and persuaded an administrator to juggle around some funds that were in his control so that it could be done. That's the kind of thing you have to do as an administrator. And I think it's not a lesson difficult to impart. It may be a lesson difficult to execute.
A good follow-up question would be to invite you to talk a little bit about what you see as the place of conferences, including the one that I'm currently the director of, as well as others. And I wanted to start by reading a comment that you made in an interview some years back. You said, "Flying down to Charlottesville is just an ordinary piece of business in the life of many academics. By Charlottesville, I don't mean all conferences are in Charlottesville, but I mean that people regularly go to conferences. It's really a phenomenon, and it has changed the structure and the way that we do business as academics." Do you still think this observation is true today?
I don't think that there is that much of that kind of thing going on today. Well, let me put it this way. If there is, I'm not being invited to it. So perhaps I'm just ignorant. And I was speaking from a perspective of being able to remember an earlier period, both in graduate school and in the first years of my professional life at Berkeley, where there weren't conferences, there weren't visiting lecturers, and there weren't that many visitors, that is, people who came to visit for a semester. That all changed. It changed in part because, at least in the early 60s, funds were made available for the setting up of conferences and other things. That all changed. And what it meant is that the academic person located necessarily in some specific town could become a cosmopolitan person, could feel that his or her home community consisted not only of those people down the hall, but those people in England, France, Israel, Germany, who shared the same interests and were working on the same problems. When that happened, the membership, your membership as an academic in a community extended around the world. And it was very exciting. It was also something, I must confess, something of a boondoggle. That is, you could, I remember my wife and I and my daughter going to Italy for a conference in a luxurious place on the sea, where all of the food and the surrounding scenery was magnificent. And I remember thinking, well, I'm being paid to do this. I'm being given the funds to come to this conference and to, in fact, to bring along my family. That was a wonderful kind of experience. Now, will that happen again? I'm not sure, because the availability of technology, like the technology that you and I are using now, means that you can have conferences without anyone leaving the comfort or discomfort of his or her home study. So I board a plane to go to Toronto or to London or Paris or Munich or wherever it might be. If that happens, then I think that there will be something definitely lost. And we will, to some extent, return to the moment where scholars had an individual relationship with their work and with a few of their colleagues, as opposed to a real relation, or an expansive relationship with others.
I hope you are enjoying my discussion with Stanley Fish. If you are, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and hit like. And as always, I would ask you to consider joining us for an upcoming LCLC conference. Consult the LouisvilleConference.com for details. Thanks again for listening, and please check back in 2 weeks to listen to the conclusion of the discussion with Stanley Fish.